leading members of Nazi Germany, 1935, are in a room and they're drafting the so-called Nuremberg laws. And the Nuremberg laws are the laws that make Jews into second-class citizens. And they do three things. They segregate Jews into ghettos, they forbid intermarriage between Jews and other Germans, and they condone confiscation of Jewish property, in other words, state-sponsored discrimination against Jews. And the Nazis are sitting there, and they basically say, we want to make these laws, but there's no international precedent for them. Nobody has done this kind of thing. And then one of the Nazis who had studied in the United States says, actually, gentlemen, you're wrong. Somebody has beaten us to the punch. The Democratic Party in the United States has laws that do all the three things that we want. The Jim Crow laws of the American South have segregation, there are anti-miscegenation laws outlawing intermarriage, and they condone state-sponsored discrimination. All we have to do is take the laws of the Democratic Party, cross out the word black, write in the word Jew, and we are home free. What am I saying here? I'm not saying that the Nazis got a parallel idea. I'm saying the actual Nazis had in their hands the blueprints of the democratic laws and used it to make the Nuremberg laws, and this fact has been completely suppressed in progressive historiography in the United States. Now, I said that the Nazis were talking about the democratic laws, and you might be like, democratic laws? Aren't you talking about the Southern laws? See, the Nazis actually knew something that we don't know. Namely, every segregation law in the United States from the 1880s to the 1950s was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials, and there is not a single exception to this rule. Once again, if you rush back to your political science textbook, this fact will be downplayed if not omitted. Why? And now we come to a little bit of the bigger picture here. The bigger picture here is that what we call history is progressive history. And we shouldn't be naive about this. The progressives themselves were fighting against earlier forms of history. And so the progressives were a kind of, you may say, intellectual militant movement that overthrew what came before them. And then in taking power, their power was in writing the history books, and that meant that they could spin the narrative and suppress facts inconvenient to their side. It's been done from the beginning of history. We should hardly be surprised it's being done now. I mentioned segregation. I want to pull back and say just a word about slavery, because when I speak on campus, it's not atypical where I'll tell students the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. And I say it so matter-of-factly that students are a little puzzled because they've always heard slavery was done by the white man or by America. And I say, look, America didn't do anything. Some Americans did it and other Americans stopped them. We need to distinguish who did it. And who did it was the Democratic Party in the North and the South. That's the key. Because the whole idea of knocking Confederate monuments is essentially a strategic stage tactic to fool you into thinking that the slavery debate was North-South. But Abraham Lincoln knew better. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, when he identified what he called the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the four bad guys of slavery, he mentioned Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. He was a Southerner. He's actually from Maryland, but the South. And then Lincoln mentions Franklin Pierce, the former president from New Hampshire, Northern Democrat. James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, Northern Democrat. And Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's supreme antagonist from Illinois, Northern Democrat. So 3 of the 4 pro-slavery champions are Northerners. And so inevitably, when I tell students this, the following happens. Some, professor of Romance languages at Bowdoin College will stand up. Mr. D'Souza, you are misleading the audience. You are misleading the audience by pointing a finger of blame solely at one party, whereas we all know there was plenty of blame to go around. Very interesting statement. First of all, it retreats from the position that the Republicans are the bad guys. It now tries, sort of with a squid-like cloud of obfuscation, to spread the blame so broadly that no one really knows what's going on. So it's really important at this time to unfurl what I call the crushing fact. The crushing fact is the fact that settles the argument at one blow. And so this is the time for me to point out that in 1860, which was the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Think about this for a moment. I'm not saying that no Republican leader owned a slave. I'm saying no Republican in the United States owned a slave. And if what I say is true, very important if, it's kind of like, reminds me of the atheist who read the Bible for the first time. He read it cover to cover, and at the end he made a single notation in the margin, important if true. Important if true. And that applies to my statement. Important if true. Important if true. But the beauty of the statement, it is a scientific statement in the sense that Karl Popper intended it, namely, it is vulnerable, naked to refutation. All you have to do is give me the name of one Republican who owned a slave, and I would have to take it back. And yet, from the time I made this statement well over 2 years ago, not a single valid counterexample has surfaced. Several months ago, I got an email from a demographer at the University of Michigan. He goes, Dinesh, I've been working this. I gotcha. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave, a solitary slave, admittedly, on his wife's side. And I said, well, that is an impressive riposte, but I need to point out to you that at the time this occurred, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. He became a Republican later. So, what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is we have a really strange phenomenon. If you look at what's going on now, you have Democrats on the left pointing the finger of racism at the very people who fought racism from the beginning of this country's history, while suppressing the fact that the actual racism came from their party. In other words, this is not just about slavery. The Democrats were the party of slavery, of segregation, of founding the Ku Klux Klan, of reviving the Ku Klux Klan, and of racial terrorism, and of opposition to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The opposition to the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Bill of 68 came mainly from the Democratic Party, and that's a fact. Now, faced with this crushing history, we have a puzzle. I mean, first of all, the very guys who have poisoned the waters are now showing up pretending to be the water commissioner. They did it. They've never admitted it. They've never apologized for it. They haven't paid 1 penny of restitution for it. And yet they're presumed to lecture the rest of us who are completely innocent on this score of being the real culprits. I mean, this is really funny. My wife, Debbie, who's a Latina, her father's Venezuelan, her mom's Mexican, and we're Dartmouth, East Indian and Latina, and you have a bunch of white guys screaming at us, racist. I mean, what is this, Saturday Night Live? And this is at an Ivy League college. Now, I do want to address, before I circle back and open the door to questions, I want to address one final point, because this is key. Very important point for the left, and it is the idea that the Democrats have a get-out-of-jail-free card. Namely, according to them, the two parties switched sides. They switched. Basically, the Republicans became Democrats, the Democrats became Republicans. Now, for anyone who actually knows anything about American history, this is akin to saying, you know, guys, there was a time, a little far back, maybe in the 1960s, when the cops all decided to become criminals. And the criminals all decided to become cops. They switched sides. And you'd be inherently like, how the hell would that happen? What kind of sense does that make? What kind of idiot statement is that? But no, this is not an idiot statement. The cause is pressed seriously that the parties switched. And the main thrust of the argument is that the racist Dixiecrats We have to define our terms. A Dixiecrat here is a member of the Dixiecrat Party, or somebody who voted against the civil rights laws of the 60s. The racist Dixiecrats all became Republicans. If true, this would vindicate the idea that the Democrats may have once been the bad guys, but now the bad guys have sort of moved over. But the beauty, again, of this kind of statement is the fact that it's empirical. It's not one of those, who's to say what's true? No, all you have to do is whip out your phone and type in the word Dixiecrat, and about 150 names will come up. And then you start to count. How many of the racist Dixiecrats became Republicans? And the correct answer, which I will tell you now, is 2. In the House, one guy, Albert Watson. In the Senate, one guy, Strom Thurmond. And all the other racist Dixiecrats lived and died in the Democratic Party. They're lionized to this day. There are buildings in Washington, D.C. named after them. Now, where does this leave us today? I think where it leaves us today is that, very sadly, some of these terrible things from history, bigotry, a fascist streak, we still have it in America. But where's it coming from? People say, Trump's a fascist. He hates democracy. He won't tolerate dissent. I'm thinking, first of all, if Trump is a fascist and he won't tolerate dissent, how come you're dissenting? Trump is bashed on every platform every minute of every day. He's bashed on the Emmys. He's bashed in Broadway shows are interrupted to bash Trump. Now, quite frankly, if this was Mussolini, he would send in a bunch of goons and beat those guys up, and that would be the end of that. That's how dictators actually behave. The other day I saw the actress Cher complaining about Trump. She goes, he beat the hell out of me on Twitter. On Twitter. A real fascist would have beaten the hell out of her, period.
Hi. So if the Democratic Party supporting slavery in the 19th century means the Democratic Party today is racist, so does that mean that Karl Marx and Engels writing for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's Republican newspaper in the 1860s, does that mean the Republican Party is the party of socialism today?
We have here an exercise in reasoning that needs to be put into slow motion to be dissected. Okay, so the reasoning is the following. First, you're contending that I contend that because the Democratic Party was the party of slavery before the Civil War, therefore the Democratic Party is racist today. I would submit that I have made no such argument here tonight. For anyone listening fairly, my argument was that the party of slavery prior to the Civil War metamorphosed into the party of racism after the Civil War. And this racism carried well into the 20th century. In fact, when we talk about things like the Klan, it's always amusing to me. People go, well, what about David Duke? This is the precise type of counterexample intended to mislead. Because if you fairly were to say, let me really look at the topic. Let me make a list of all the Ku Klux Klan leaders, every Grand Dragon and Grand Kleagle, going back to the 1870s to now. And let's just put an R or a D after their name. 99% of them would be Democrats. That's a fact. The idea of David Duke is a false flag intended to camouflage attention and prevent a legitimate generalization from being made. Now, so the Democratic Party isn't the party of racism because of what happened before slavery. The Democratic Party self-consciously embraced racism after slavery. Lyndon Johnson, this is a very good example, because Lyndon Johnson is supposed to be a metaphor for the whole Democratic Party. Yeah, he was kind of a racist in his old Texas country boy days, the narrative goes, but then he became a marvelous, morally enlightened person and championed the Civil Rights Act. I would submit that if you read anything about Lyndon Johnson, you will see that this is a flat-out lie. The fact of the matter is that Lyndon Johnson was routinely using the N-word after the Civil Rights Act. And there is the multiple examples of this from Robert Caro, from Doris Kearns Goodwin, from Lyndon Johnson's own driver. This is corroborated, it's attested, it's indisputable, and yet it is pushed under the rug by progressive historians who need the fake narrative. The fake narrative is the narrative of conversion. There was no conversion. Lyndon Johnson, once a bigot, always a bigot. So now a more interesting question emerges. Why would a bigot promote the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And I would submit that the reason for that is that the bigot realized, I can't cash in on white racism anymore. I've got to create a new type of dependent class of people who are now going to have to vote for me, and they're the very people I've been kicking around. Just listen to Lyndon Johnson's famous Howard University speech, a beautiful example of outright deception. Here's Johnson. He goes, "You can't take a man who has been hobbled for decades and bring him up to the starting line and tell him to run on his own." And now I ask you, what is omitted from this moving sentence? What is omitted from this moving sentence? Who the hell has been hobbling this guy for decades, if not you? If not you? So if you, Lyndon Johnson, take 1 ounce of moral responsibility and say, I did it, and now I am willing to pay a price to set it right, but the deceitful bigot could not admit that. Even then, he was playing the same game that is played to now, which is let's blame it on somebody else. You cannot take a man who has been hobbled. Let's move into the convenient passive voice, as if somebody else did it. I'm here to fix it. I'm Lyndon Johnson. So history involves reading a little between the lines, recognizing that just as we have fake news, we have fake history, we have fake scholarship, you're smart enough here to know this and to be able to do this kind of reading, and it's very liberating. When you do it, it's very liberating. Okay, next question.
I think your response to that last question is definitely helpful in recognizing that some facts may be misleading, such as if I were to come up and give a lecture on Karl Marx and the history of communism in the Republican Party. Obviously, we can cherry pick facts. And so I want to bring up this concern I have with some of your crushing facts, right? In that when you state just one small fact without contextualizing it, you run the risk of being counter to the generalization, which obviously my friend's fact was, right?
Agree completely.
And so I have a couple of facts that I think can help round out the picture. So one here, in response to the Southern strategy question. This is a quote from Kevin Phillips, Nixon's political strategist.
Yes.
It says, "The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That is where the votes are. Without prodding from blacks, the whites will backside into their old, comfortable arrangement with local Democrats." Right? So he's making the argument that we need the votes from the negrophobe whites, not from the urban whites, as you suggested. And that's coming from Nixon's campaign manager. Secondly, data on support for the Civil Rights Act. In the South, 7% of Democrats in Congress supported the Civil Rights Act, and 0% of Republicans did. And in the North, 96% of Democrats and 84% of Republicans supported the Civil Rights Act. That fact, to me, seems like this was not a party issue, but a geography issue, in that very few people in the South supported the Civil Rights Act, and the vast majority of Northerners in both parties did. So then, the fact that right now the South is strongly Republican, and prior to the Civil Rights Act, the South was prominently Democrat, suggests to me that the party representation has switched to match that geographical preference.
Excellent question. And I will try to do justice because you've raised a lot of points. Let's start with Kevin Phillips. You need to pick up Kevin Phillips' book, The Emerging Republican Majority. You described Kevin Phillips as Nixon's campaign manager, which he was not. Second of all, Kevin Phillips says very clearly on the first page, you are going to get from me an analysis of voting patterns in America. It is not a description of anything that Nixon did. In fact, Kevin Phillips says, Nixon has not seen any of my work. I'm writing it after the election. So Phillips makes it really clear that he is not the architect of anything. He is rather interpreting in his own way. And you have to remember, Kevin Phillips is a guy who's swung from one side to the other of the political pendulum. So you've got a character who's mercurial in his judgments and has said the opposite things at different times. Nevertheless, let's move on to the larger point, which is, according to you, this party division is a geographical and not a partisan divide. And the technique you're using to demonstrate this is you could call it controlling for region. Controlling for region, you're saying, the discrepancy between the parties at least diminishes even if it doesn't go away altogether. The problem with the controlling for region is that you cannot control for something when the party itself is pushing to achieve that regional phenomenon. Let me tell you what I mean. We think today of the South as being the racist side of the country. C. Van Woodward tells us, the Yale historian, that after the Civil War, in the early 20th century and in the late 19th century, when the segregation debate, he goes, there was massive opposition to segregation in the South. He goes, this emergence of a Southern racist party, he says, was not foreordained. It was not the automatic result of the war. He goes, don't confuse slavery with racism. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Hold on, let me finish. The point I want to make is this. The Democratic Party cultivated the bigotry in the South that became a Southern phenomenon. So you can't now say, well, let's control for Southernness and take it all out and excuse all the Democrats because they're just being good old Southerners. I'm saying no. I'm saying that the Democrats polluted the South with a racist ideology and drove the Republicans out of the South. This was the whole point of the Ku Klux Klan. Racial terrorism was aimed at crushing the black Republican Party in the South. So you can't control for these things. The Democratic Party had its base in the South, and it was a racist base. The Republican Party has its base in the North, and it was a non-racist base. So now we turn to your last point, which is the most tempting of all. Gee, Dinesh, the South used to be Republican. I'm sorry, the South used to be Democratic through most of the 20th century. It's now Republican. Big switch. No. The key question here, I agree, I would add to your switch. Blacks who used to be Republicans are now Democrats. Big switch. The key question when you see these switches is to ask this question: when did the switch occur? So for blacks, let me tell you, the switch occurred in the 1930s. In 1932, 75% of blacks voted for Herbert Hoover. In 1936, 75% of blacks voted for FDR. Blacks switched into the Democratic Party, having nothing to do with the civil rights movement and nothing to do with racism, because the Democratic Party at that time was openly the party of segregation and the Ku Klux Klan. It was the economic benefits of the New Deal. That's a fact. The other fact is that the South moved into the Republican Party under Reagan and in the 90s under Gingrich. So what was the Reagan agenda? Now, this I know from being up close. The Reagan agenda was patriotism, anti-communism, free markets, family values, pro-life, Christianity. Now, a very appealing agenda to a lot of Southerners. This was a continuation of the strategy of appealing to the non-racist South. So here's the beauty of it. If you want to be empirical, step back and draw two lines. The line of Southern racism, which you'll notice in the 20th century, is going like this, down ever since World War II. And the line of Southern republicanism, which is going like this, in the other direction. So as the South becomes less and less racist, it becomes more and more Republican.